Welcome to Back to the Bible. Today, pastor and Bible teacher Bryan Clark talks about leadership. If God has called you to be a leader, He's actually called you to be a shepherd. Find out about this unique role in today's message. Here's Bryan Clark with our message, starting in 1 Peter chapter 5 at verse 2.
Verse 2, shepherd the flock of God among you, exercising oversight. He says, but voluntarily, according to the will of God, and not for sordid gain, but with eagerness. This idea of sordid gain is kind of the idea of money and stuff. Religion has always been big business. It was big business in the first century, it's big business today. And there's always been people who in the religious world have been able to accumulate a lot of wealth and stuff. It was a problem then, it's a problem today. But when we think about this, so as we're thinking about kind of this concept of elders and pastors and spiritual leaders, there's kind of multiple layers to this. For those of us that are elders and pastors and leaders, the application seems fairly obvious. For those of you in the congregation, there's also an awareness. This is what you should expect from your leaders. But I think anyone, as a Christian who's called to a position of leadership anywhere, out in the marketplace, on an athletic team, in a school, in a neighborhood, in a family, the principles still apply. What is it that motivates your call, your leadership? And we would, I think, all agree this allure of money and stuff is a problem. So in the church culture, which is specifically what Peter's talking about, he's not talking about lay elders out in the marketplace that are pursuing money. He's talking about making money by being a pastor. So basically, who's at risk to go down that path? I would suggest to you it's not like the associate pastors. Nobody decides to be a youth pastor for the money. Nobody decides to be an associate pastor for the money. It's not the lay elders, they don't get paid anything. It's people like me. We are the ones that are at risk of getting sidetracked, to put it crudely, cash in on our position in order to make more money. I guess that's kind of crude and straight up. But here's what happens. In the Christian subculture, we have all kinds of pastors, musicians, writers who make millions and millions and millions of dollars. They live in mansions, they're on TV, they're on radio, they have jets. They jet set around and they've kind of cashed in. And what I've kind of watched over the years as a pastor is you kind of reach a point, seems like kind of in your 50s, where there's a little bit of a restlessness, you've kind of established yourself, and there's a temptation to kind of cash in on that, to write the books, to speak at the conferences, to get on the preaching circuit, radio and television, because there are millions and millions and millions of dollars that are available to do that. I think there is a long list of preachers and Christians that started off very sincere for the sake of the gospel. God used them, and as they became more established, the allure of cashing in became greater and greater, and eventually they lose their way. It happens again and again and again. Ultimately, who suffers? Answer is the sheep. The wolves are moving in. The wolves are attacking, and the shepherd is nowhere to be found. The shepherd is cashing in. The shepherd is seeking significance. The shepherd is trying to build up a bank account. The shepherd is jet setting here and there while the sheep are valuable, and the church suffers the consequence. I, by nature, am a people watcher. And one of the things I've watched over the years are my fellow preachers, kind of my peers and those older to me, and watch those that finish well and those that have lost their way, and kind of tried to understand what makes the difference. And one of the things that I've seen as a pattern is often preachers like me get in their 50s, and for whatever reason they get restless and they start to think about cashing it in and kind of getting a payday. One of the things I wanted to be true of me is to stay true to the fact that my call is to be a pastor. It's to be a shepherd, is to live among the sheep. One of the things that the elders have discussed is we want to be very diligent to weed out those candidates that see this as a platform to advance their career, to write the books, to get on the preaching circuit. One of the things that grieves my heart is I think a lot of students today are going to seminary with this dream. They dream about being the next author. They dream about being the next conference speaker. They dream about kind of being the next Christian celebrity, and it's a very bad mindset when God has called you to shepherd the sheep. The concern is cashing in on a position for personal gain. Verse 3, nor yet as lording it over those allotted to your charge, but proving to be examples to the flock. In the Greco-Roman culture, leadership was very heavy-handed. There was a strong sense of authority, do what you're told or else. I think that's what he's talking about, lording it over those in your charge. That's not what a shepherd does. That's not how a shepherd leads. If we go back to our imagery, that's more the cowboy with the bullwhip and all the hooting and hollering and driving the cattle. That's not what God calls us to as shepherds and elders and leaders. But I would say for any of us that are in positions of leadership anywhere in the community, to really think about what he just said. Because what he just said is it's not to use your position to somehow lord it over someone else, but rather the alternative is to be an example, to be a pattern. Basically what he's saying is you should be able to say to whoever it is that you lead, if you want to know how to live a hope-filled life in a culture of despair, just follow me. It's a very sobering thought, but that is the call of every leader. It's not about making money. It's not about your significance. It's not about advancing your career. It's not about trying to be somebody. It's about understanding God has given you sheep, and your responsibility is to shepherd these sheep, to care for them and to love them and to protect them and to be part of the healing of their wounds, and simply stated to say to them, if you want to know how to live a hope-filled life in a culture full of despair, follow me.
Let's get back to Bryan Clark in 1 Peter chapter 5.
Verse 4, and when the chief shepherd, that would be Jesus, appears, you will receive the unfading crown of glory. So when Jesus returns, there will be this crown of glory. Now, some people interpret this as like the pastors and elders get their own special crown. I think that's off. As a matter of fact, I think it's way off. I think there's a consistent biblical theology that all of us have a calling, and all of us are equally responsible to be faithful to our calling. Nobody's more than, nobody's less than. Nobody ends up with a special crown. The elders is plural, but when he says the crown is singular. So I think what he's saying is that when we do our job correctly, then we all join in the celebration, this grand victory celebration when Jesus returns. So I have my responsibility, you have your responsibility. Part of my responsibility as your pastor is to help you fulfill your responsibility, and we all join in the celebration, the victory celebration when Jesus returns. I think that's what he's referring to. Verse 5, then, you younger men, and I think that's kind of a cultural reflection, younger people, men and women, you younger men likewise be subject to your elders. In every generation throughout history, there's always been a bit of a struggle with younger generations submitting to the older generation. That's part of how we're wired. That's always going to be true. I do think in 21st century kind of American Christian culture, there are some problems with this, though. I think we've become so individualized, we've become so selfish and self-centered, and everything's about me, that we've kind of reduced a lot of our Christianity down to, this is just between me and Jesus, and nobody can tell me what to do. And a lot of those people have dismissed the idea of church. I am the church. I don't need all of that. And they find their favorite preacher online, and they've convinced themselves that's kind of what God wants for them. And in essence, they're unwilling to submit to the leadership of the church. I always find it ironic that these same people that are unwilling to submit to leadership in the church go right out into the marketplace and expect the people under them to submit to their leadership. So they expect to be respected as authority, but they themselves don't want to respect authority. But here's the deal. Those people aren't here. They're not here because they don't need to be here. So what's the point of going on with that conversation? So I want to flip it over a little bit, because the reality is I think that is true, and I think it is a problem. But I think there's always been a remnant that seek to be faithful to what God has called them to. If you go to a lot of churches today, you see either a lot of old people or you see a lot of young people. One of the things that really excites me is we have great younger generation people. People in their 30s, people in their 20s, people in their teens. These are people that love Jesus. These are people that love this church. These are people that give of their time and their talent and treasure. These are people that live with a sense of call, and they would say, count me in. These are people who have been wonderfully honoring and respectful to people like me and the other elders and pastors and people on staff. And rather than kind of rebuking the people that aren't here, which makes no sense, it makes more sense to me to celebrate the awesome people that are here. And this younger generation that is going to take up the baton, and they are going to lead, and they're going to lead the generations under them. And I'm super excited about this younger generation. I think we're in great hands, and I think that's something that we celebrate together, because there's always a remnant that says, I want to be obedient, I want to follow Jesus, and God is going to use them to be world changers, and we're blessed to have so many of them among us as part of our family. So that's, to me, the better way to turn that. The last thing he says then, be subject to your elders, and all of you clothe yourselves with humility toward one another. For God is opposed to the proud, but gives grace to the humble. So everyone together, all of us. The idea of clothe is a Greek word that referred to a slave putting on his or her apron. It's the idea of putting on the clothing of a servant, and we all come together, we serve one another in humility, ultimately for the cause of Christ. There is a reminder, a verse from Proverbs, that if you're proud, God has his way of humbling you. He will oppose you, he will refine you, he will take you through the leadership school of leadership until that pride is gone. For those that are humble, God favors that, he celebrates that, he blesses that. But at the end of the day, we all come together as the people of God, humbly serving one another for the cause of Christ. Peter's talked about that several times. So, kind of to bring this to a close, it's not really complicated. If God has called you to be a leader, whether it's a leader at church or out in the marketplace, in your family, in your school, on your athletic team, wherever God has you, He has called you to be a shepherd. He has not given you that position just to make money. He's not given you that position to cash in. He's not given you that position in order to somehow find significance or advance your career or to try to be somebody or to take advantage of the people that you've been called to lead. God has called you as a Christian leader to be a shepherd, to live among the sheep, to love the sheep, to guide the sheep, to lead the sheep, to feed the sheep, to water the sheep, to protect the sheep, to genuinely oversee and care about those sheep. And ultimately, it's the responsibility of all of us as leaders to say to the people whom we lead, if you want to understand how to live as a hope-filled person in a culture of despair, just follow me.
Now Bryan Clark joins us in the studio with author Kara Whitney and Back to the Bible CEO Arnie Cole.
Bryan, sometimes people get an idea of a leader as being this really glamorous position, but the last statement in your message where you're inviting people to follow you as an example, that's not that glamorous. So, in fact, it's rather daunting.
It is daunting. I remember the first time I really understood Paul saying to the Corinthians, "You follow me as I follow Christ," and thought, wow, that is a sobering thing to say to people. But a leader, by definition, means someone's following. And so the seriousness of that can be overwhelming. We as shepherds, it's possible to lead the people over the cliff or into a pack of wolves, and that's where it must be taken very seriously.
So, Bryan, I've always admired your gift of when you teach that it reaches from 8 years old to 80 years old. And I think God's really gifted you that way. Do you have any tips for us that helps you relate to multiple generations of people?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I think it's always the easiest as a leader or as a preacher to talk to your own generation because you're one of them, but to stretch to other generations. So when I started, I had to figure out how to reach the older generation. Now I am the older generation, so I have to figure out how to reach the young people and to understand they have different values, they have different motivations, but that doesn't mean that's right or wrong. I mean, there's a tendency to think our way's right and your way's wrong. That's not really helpful. So what I've found over the years is it takes a lot of listening, takes a lot of learning and understanding. I don't care for all these books that characterize the millennials or the boomers as if they're all the same. I just want to try to understand how they view life and their worldview and their values and motivations and understand how that's different and how I can help, how I can speak to them, be part of that. So I'd rather understand than criticize. And in a lot of ways, the only way for that to happen is to spend time together and learn and grow from one another.
But still, with our culture being all about me, I don't know how many millions of selfies are taken a day. How do you navigate that climate about it's all about me?
Yeah, so great question. And I do think the selfie is an interesting commentary on our culture. You see it everywhere you go. It used to be somebody took a picture of people together, and now we take pictures of ourselves, and that's who we are as people. But that isn't going to change until somebody encounters the resurrected Christ and grows and is discipled in their relationship with Christ. So we can fight that all day long, but until they experience true conversion and grow in their maturity, it's not going to change. So one of the ways to think about it is the gospel is relevant. Jesus is relevant to every person's life in a deeply meaningful way. You just have to figure out for this particular generation, these people, what is that? What's the searching? What's the emptiness? What is it they're looking for? And how does Jesus intersect their lives in a way they would find meaningful? So, yes, they are consumers, but what we have to offer them is what they're looking for. We just figure out how to do that in a creative way. Once they encounter Christ and begin to experience discipleship, they will grow and change and learn to think of others as more important than themselves. But that's a long process, and if they don't encounter Christ, it's never going to happen.
As I said, my thinking as I was listening to you, it just takes a lot of time. I mean, they still have the God-shaped hole in their heart that needs to be filled. So by talking to them, instead of looking at them like they're a bunch of self-centered weirdos, probably not good. So
it's a lot like your own kids. It's a process that over time, there's a process of maturing and changing. It doesn't help to just call them out and call them names and constantly criticize them.
And to lump them in with this whole group.
Yeah. Some are that way, some aren't.
Yeah. My Bible study group, all my ladies are in their 80s or 90s. And I love it because the things they've faced gives me so much hope because at some point I'll be there. There's kids that aren't believers. They've lost spouses, some of them. They're going through hip surgeries or whatever. And so I just see how they lean on Christ. And that grows me spiritually, their wisdom. On the other hand, I can encourage them to evangelize, to talk to young people that, hey, we're not weirdos. We just grew up in secular homes or, from different times.
Yeah.
So that's encouraging stuff.
Yeah, and I've found, too, it's good to have a group of friends, a group of people that hold you accountable.
Yeah, when God uses you greatly, there's a great risk in that. One of the things that I often think about is the founder of Back to the Bible, Mr. App. I mean, I could take you right now and I could take you to the house he lived in, where he raised his family. It's a very small house, a very quiet neighborhood. He drove a very average car. He was a very simple man, and I don't mean that disrespectfully, but he was just a godly, faithful man who was trying to be obedient to what God called him to. He never saw himself as a celebrity. He didn't have lots of money. He didn't have a big house. I think he just wanted to be faithful. He's an excellent model, I think, of what God's calling us to.
You're listening to Back to the Bible. If you'd like to listen again, visit backtothebible.org. That's backtothebible.org.